Good evening. We would like to welcome you here tonight in this webinar with Dr. Chris Warton, hosted by Doctors for Life. My name is Martus de Wet. I will be just checking on the technical side of things as far as I can. We will, perhaps as we start, just to check if everything is working well, if you could please perhaps send us a chat from where you are in the chat function of this webinar. You will see there's both a chat function and a question and answer function. Perhaps you can just greet us from where you are and tell us if you can hear well. And you can just tell us where you're from, which city or which area. Then we will also know where you are from. You will also see that there's a question and answer function. I will not be doing the formal introduction of Dr. Warton. That will still follow, but just as we are waiting for people to join us, there's a question and answer function, and throughout the webinar, please feel free to post your questions there. We will then go through the questions and try to ask as many as handle many as possible when we've heard Dr. Warton's presentation. So please feel free, as you have questions that comes up, to just post them in the question and answer function, and we will try to handle as many as possible. At this juncture, I will give over to Dr. Albu van Eeden, the CEO of Doctors for Life, to just introduce the webinar and introduce Dr. Warton.
Well, on behalf of Doctors for Life, we are very excited to present our speaker for tonight. Dr. Chris Warton has been a member of Doctors for Life from, Chris, if I'm not mistaken, from the early 90s already. He's been of immense value to the organization. But I think his biggest value is what he's going to share with us and present to us tonight. I just want to say that we have a good spectrum of attendees in terms of qualifications, different medical practitioners, legal people, and so forth. We are happy to have all of you here from South Africa, a large amount of 9 countries, Mozambique, Philippines, Namibia, Botswana, Netherlands, Northern Ireland, Germany, USA, and France. So welcome to all of you. Dr. Chris Warton, and I've been asked to keep the introduction as short as possible. He can expand where he thinks he should. He's been lecturing in human anatomy. He's written books on embryology and neuroscience, and he's a neuroscientist as well. Now, this is invaluable because the whole issue of embryology is one of the most contested areas in the whole abortion debate, and the whole point of the beginning of the life of a human being. And I think Dr. Chris Warton will be able to speak exactly to that. So, Chris, welcome to you here. And I think with that, I'm handing over to you.
Hello, I'm Chris Warton, speaking to you from Cape Town. And it really is a pleasure to be with you this evening. I might say it's a pleasure to be with you, but I've spoken on this subject many times over the years, and I really don't like talking about it. I find it's a subject that's contentious. There's conflict, unpleasantness, and it's not a nice subject at all, actually. Embryology is a wonderful subject, it's marvelous. But the whole issue of the ethics around the unborn is a painful thing. And I got pulled into it because as an anatomist, I realized early on as an anatomist that because I knew about embryology, I had a moral responsibility to talk into the issues of abortion and early life ethics. And so I found the whole thing really, I have no choice but to get involved. And so I got pulled into it, and reluctantly I've been dragged along by the responsibility over the years. But let me start my slides, and then we can go through things. I don't quite know what's happening here. Sure. Here we go. Right. So we're looking this evening at the whole subject of the humanity of the newborn. If you get bored with the talk, there's lots of pictures of the sea around Cape Town. And personal background, my background, I'm an anatomist, medically qualified. I've been teaching anatomy for 40 years, just recently retired. I also worked in a psychiatry outpatients department for 30 years as a part-timer. And just recently, I've been part of a maternity psychiatry clinic, which has been a wonderful experience, talking to young women with issues, all the different psychiatric issues they may have, numbers of them sadly pregnant as a consequence of rape. And so I've been involved in this area for many years. And I want to say at the outset, as I've said so often in debate situations, we need to try and think clearly before we can be involved in what's going on. Because when we do actually involve, often we don't think clearly. And certainly in a debate situation, or you're discussing something with somebody, you need to try and think as clearly as you possibly can. The approach that I want to take is two issues. Firstly, why is the illness of the unborn so significant? And secondly, can science inform our understanding? Science can't do ethics as such. Often people look to science to give us ethical answers. But science only describes what is, and ethics is about not what is, but what ought to be. And so science can inform our ethics. But if we try and take science and move it straight into ethics, in actual fact, we end up with something that abuses science and abuses ethics. So we can look at why is the humanness of the unborn significant, and can science help us in working that out? I also want to say up front that it's important that we understand our own worldview and ethical position as others, because often the discussions around these things come from insolubles. I'm an evangelical Christian. I look to the Bible as my source of authority, but I'm very conscious that in this webinar and
Dr. Warton, I think we've lost you for a moment.
we're back in business now. Are we in business? Can you hear me again?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, there we go. So I think it's important to understand the foundation of our worldview and our ethical position, because so that we know what we're saying to people, how are we going. I'm going to need to talk fast over these things, I think. At the outset, also, I want to say that caring for the mother is obviously critically important, and often folk who are pro-choice imagine that we don't care for the mother. And caring for the mother is obviously critical. But the real question that we have is, do we have one patient or two patients? And that brings us to the central issue. And I believe the central issue around early life ethics And we mustn't get sidetracked into other issues. The central issue is the embryo or fetus a human or not? If it's not a human being, then having an abortion is no different from having an appendicectomy. But if it is a human being, it changes the whole scenario completely. And I want to suggest that we must be careful not to get sidetracked into second issues, like, for example, does the fetus suffer pain when it's being aborted, or the whole variety of side issues. They're important. They have their value. The issue that we must focus on is whether or not the fetus is a human being. But then the question comes, what is a human being, or a human individual, or a human person? And that issue I've found over many years of debates actually never comes up in a debate situation. Although it's justified to a secular audience, position can you hear me? Can you hear me? Are we back in business?
Hi, Dr. Warton. Yes, I think we should perhaps just pause for a moment, and we have an alternative plan for the sound. So if we can just pause for a moment, and then we'll be back. I'll call you on your cell phone, just if we can pause for a moment.
Thank you.
Hi, welcome back. Oh, we're getting a lot of feedback from... Hello?
Dr. Warton, you can just switch off your sound completely on your side.
Yeah, just cut the sound completely. Hello, can you hear now?
Yes, we hear you quite well.
All right. Right, that's good. Can we proceed? Can we proceed then? The slide that I've got in front of me, which I hope you've got in front of you, is what is a human being, human person, human individual? And just making the point that, having debated many times on this subject, nobody argues about how we define this. Philosophically, there's lots of debate about a human person, when is a person, and so on. But in practice, all of us understand that a human being is a human being. And there's a deep down commitment, actually, in my experience, in everybody. And so the idea of what is a human being, I think there's more or less consensus on that in practice. Now, the real question we want to make is, when we look at this, these are 4 of my grandchildren, we would acknowledge the middle one is a human being, and that one's the next one down, he's 4, and this one's 2, and this one's just newborn. No question, these are human beings, and I don't think anybody would debate that. The real question is, this little one, was he a human being 3 months ago? And that's really the center of it. So the question is, and I believe when we discuss this and we debate these things in public, we need to focus on the centrality of whether or not the fetus is a human being. And the related question, when can you kill a human being? I remember in a debate in the Standing Committee on Abortion many years ago in Cape Town, in front of a parliamentary subcommittee, I took some fetuses in bottles from our department for people to have a look at. And when I got to the security, the woman at the front of the security looked at them and said, "Oh, look at the babies." Now, they were sort of 16, 18, 20-week fetuses in bottles. And when I was in the Standing Committee, I handed them round because I thought they would speak louder than I would. And there was something that rather shook me. There was a parliamentarian on the other side who held a fetus in her hand, looked at it and said, "Yes, of course we know this is a human life. But," and I thought, now there's the rub. You know, is it a human being? But then, can you kill human beings? And I was chilled by the thought that actually to be able to say it's a human life, but we can kill it, is a very concerning thing. And I think that's a position that quite often one will find in a modern context. The next thing I think is very important, are there degrees of humanness? You know, people talk about a potential human being, and I want to suggest that there cannot be degrees of humanness. Humanness is not a quantitative thing. It's a qualitative thing. You're either a human or you're not. And if we adopt the ideas, so often people do, that there's you're a potential human being and eventually you become a human being, you've opened the idea to every horrible kind of ethical dilemma. Humanness, you either are human or you're not. And that from whenever you start to be human, and we will look at that, you're either a human being and a complete human being or not. We must never move into the concept of potential human beings. Sometimes we have to choose between patients. You've got 2 kidneys from a dead donor, and you've got 5 people who need them, and you choose. But we don't ever choose because on the basis that one person is more human than another. we have other criteria, but we're conscious with living people that there's no degrees of humanness. I'm conscious, though, that when we talk about these things, certainly as a pro-lifer, people think we're applying cold ethical principles to living people. And that's not so at all. We've got to understand the principles, and we've got to understand the key things. I was going to talk about bioethics, but we've lost too much time already. But another question then, is it perhaps that the fetus becomes a person at a defined point? Maybe you're either a person or you're not a person, you're either a human or you're not a human, but maybe there's a particular point at which it becomes human, like viability, you know, will it survive out of the womb, or some sort of neurological feature, is it moving, synapses working, is the brain developed or whatever. And I think this is an issue where science can help us. We might decide the issue theologically or philosophically, but embryology can inform our ethics. It doesn't tell us what we ought to do or what we ought not to do, but it can tell us, are there defined points in development that might say this is a human or not? The embryology I'm looking at is not cutting edge embryology. It's a standard embryology that people have known for decades. And I think if we're hoping to find some embryological new discovery that's going to decide the point one way or the other, it's not like that. It's not a matter of details, it's a matter of the big picture. And I think the big picture is very clear. Basic cell biology. In human cells, there are 23 pairs of chromosomes, which completely describe the individual as accurately as if you were looking at an identical twin. So if you look at an identical twin, you can describe the other twin precisely. And the information in the cell, in the nucleus of the cell, represents 3 billion bits of information. So there's an enormous amount of information in there, and the information describes the person, but also describes how to make the person. I must admit, having taught embryology for many years, one of the things that I find absolutely stunning is the thought that there is information in the cell that can tell nerves which way to travel, arteries which way to go, neurons which way to go, the indescribable complexity of the brain. How do you tell a nerve which doesn't even speak English which way to go down an arm? And the whole thing is mind-boggling. But anyway, we've got in all our complete cells, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes with 3 billion bits of information, which represents incidentally about 750 Bibles worth of information. Okay. Now, when we're talking about development, we start off with the ovum and the spermatozoon. If you look at this is an ovum, a picture from my manuals, okay? And the cell inside here that I'm indicating is the oocyte, which has got 23 chromosomes in it. There's a layer around it called the zona pellucida. The function of that I'll tell you just now. And outside of that, there are these cells that I'm indicating here called the corona radiata. And they're cells that have been ripped off from the follicle of the ovary of the mother. The spermatozoa also got 23 chromosomes, not 23 pairs. And I often think it's like a missile with a warhead, and the warhead is the nucleus with its 23 chromosomes in it. There's a middle piece, which is the powerhouse, and then the tail, which drives it along. On any particular act of sexual intercourse, under normal circumstances, there are about 100 million sperms, and only one of them should win the race. So the night you were conceived, if we defined your parents and the night you were conceived, the odds of you being you are about 100 million to 1 against. Okay, and that's the spermatozoa. Now, fertilization takes place in this picture on the top left. The sperms are deposited around the cervix of the uterus and migrate up through the uterus and the fallopian tubes, and fertilization takes place out of the far end of the fallopian tube. And what happens is, as the sperms approach the ovum, and this over here is the surface of the ovum, the embryo the sperm releases from a thing called the acrosomal cap a whole lot of enzymes which burrow through the corona radiata and then burrow into that membrane around the oocyte or egg cell and burrow through there. And one of them, hopefully just one, wins the race, and it breaks through. And as it does break through that zona pellucida, the cell releases calcium, and the zona pellucida becomes impenetrable to other sperms. The reason of that mechanism is that if more than one sperm gets through, the whole thing doesn't work. We've all seen children with Down syndrome, and they've got one extra chromosome. If two sperms got in there, there'd be 23 extra chromosomes, and such a situation never produces a living child. So that's the process of fertilization. The sperm moves into the oocyte, the chromosomes are released, and they enter into a process of cell division, which is called mitosis. It happens in all our cells as they divide. It also happens in the cells of elephants and bananas and fungi. Mitosis is one of those basic things that we share as living organisms, or as eukaryotic living organisms. And at the end of that process, the combination divides into two cells, and that's called a zygote. So that's fertilization. I want to suggest that is the one big event in the whole process we're looking at. Is a return to the diploid state. That means we've got 23 pairs of chromosomes. The sex of the baby is determined. The gene code is defined and set at that point. So that if you could read the DNA of that little combination, that zygote, that pair of cells, if you could read the DNA, you could describe the adult individual to come as accurately as if you were looking at their adult identical twin. Our genome is defined. My genome was defined 9 months before I was born in 1952, and it was defined, okay, and it was set. And at that point, my life or your life as a human organism began. I use the term human organism advisedly. I'm not talking about whether we got a soul or what a human person is or whatever. I'm talking about as a biological organism. Your life as an individual started at that point. When I talk about a human organism, I'm talking about a complete organism, not just part of one. Someone might say, well, your white blood cells have got the same genome. And I say, that's true, but my white blood cells are not a whole organism. They're a part of me. When from the time of fertilization, we're dealing with the whole human organism. It's got its own unique genome, unless there's an identical twin to come. It's not a part of the mother. And this is an important thing to affirm to people. Maybe it's familiar to all of us, but to people who don't understand that the embryo is not a part of the mother, but an organism living inside another organism, totally dependent on the other organism, but one organism living inside another. Dare I say it in a revolting way, it's like a tapeworm living in your intestine. It's one organism living in another organism. In that case, it's one tapeworm living inside a human being. Here we're looking at one embryo living inside a mother, but a completely separate organism. And an organism that, given the right series of environments, has the potential to become a fully functioning adult. That embryo, that conceptus, given the right circumstances and nutrition and environment and so on, will actually develop, barring the catastrophes of life, will develop into a fully functioning adult. We know many get lost in the way, but that's the principle. What then happens is now, the embryo has formed, and it develops within a few days into a ball of cells called a morula, which looks like a mulberry. It's not a marula, it's a morula, and the word morula is a Latin word for mulberry, because it looks like all the little balls there. And it's a solid ball of cells. And then after about 5 or 6 days, liquid collects inside and it expands to form a ball, a hollow ball with a lump of cells inside. And the lump of cells inside, which I'm indicating now, is called the embryoblast, and that became you. And the cells around the outside, which is called the trophoblast, actually develop into much of the placenta and the membranes. And that's what you look like at around day 5. Day 6, the blastocyst develops a capacity to burrow in. Up till now, it's been floating down the fallopian tube towards the uterus. But at day 6, it develops a capacity to attach to tissues wherever it is and to burrow in. And hopefully that's in the wall of the uterus. But if it's fallen out and gone in the wrong direction, that could be on the outside of your intestine. And it burrows in, and the surface covers over, and we say implantation has taken place. Again, the embryo, it's the same embryo, but it's just changed environment. And a placenta forms around it. And without getting lost in the details, because we really don't have time, the mother's blood, this thing over here that I'm indicating at the top, shows that as the early embryonic placenta burrows into the tissues, it opens up the maternal blood vessels, and blood from the mother starts flowing through the embryonic tissues. So maternal blood flows through the embryonic tissues and starts to provide the nutrition and oxygen and so on that's needed. But even though the mother's blood is passing through the embryonic tissues, the mother's blood, and soon there will be a circulation from the embryo, the bloods never mix. They're separate organisms, and they must remain separate organisms. I find it breathtaking that for 9 months, the fetus can be inside the mother. And if the mother may be HIV positive, but the fetus frequently does not become HIV positive because the barrier between the maternal and the embryonic and fetal bloods is so good. Anyway, second week of development. This is the week before the mom misses her first period. The inner cells form 2 layers of cells, and that's called the bilaminar disc, the 2-layered disc. So week 2, you have 2 layers of cells called the bilaminar disc. If we take that little disc that you can see over here, you look at this disc, if you look at it from the one side, that's roughly what it looks like. There are some details there that I might mention, but there's one disc like that. There are a couple of spots. This little spot at the top is called the oropharyngeal membrane, which would be between your tonsils now if you still had it. The one at the other end, that's called the cloacal membrane, which would cover your anus. And this little area in between is a very special area called the primitive streak, which makes some other cells, and you can see that here. If you cut this embryo across and had a look at the cross section, you would see here's 1 layer, 2 layers there. This comes to be called the ectoderm. This is called the endoderm. And cells from this primitive streak here break off into the area in between and form a 3rd layer. And so we say there's an ectoderm, which becomes the epidermis of your skin, among other things, and an endoderm, which becomes the lining of your gut, and the mesoderm, which becomes most of the meat and bones in between. And it's the 3rd week of development. The embryo has grown from 0.2 of a millimeter to 2.5 millimeters, and the mother's period is now late. Okay. This series of pictures shows how the nervous system develops. It develops in week 4. And a plate in the ectoderm forms. And again, there's so much to talk about which we can't cover. But basically, a layer of the ectoderm forms. So we're looking at the sort of back of the embryo, if you like. And an area shaped like the sole of a shoe forms, and a groove forms down the middle of it, which we call the neural groove, and then the sides close over, and as you can see here, the two sides, this side and that side, actually close over, and they join together, and it forms a tube down the back of the embryo. And here you can see that tube there running down the back. That will become the spinal cord. These bumps up at the top will become the brain. And this last picture here, these are the first three bubbles that form the brain. They're called the primary brain vesicles: forebrain, midbrain, hindbrain. It looks very simple. The brain is incredibly complicated in the future, but that's the basic pattern. And if you're a healthcare professional, I'm sure you've seen people with spina bifida where this didn't close. Right. The next point, this is all mind-boggling in terms of the details, but we're not going to look at the details. In the 4th week of development, right now we've got a flat embryo which has got this area that's folded up around it, stuck on the back. Now, the question is, you may have noticed, but you're not flat. And you're not flat with skin on the back of you and your intestine spread all over the front of you. What actually happens is that the embryo folds. And a flattened embryo, the sides of the embryo close around, almost like if you had a soft paperback book and you just bent it around in your hands and the sides came round. Sides come round like this and like that, and they come round and gradually it joins up down the front, and you end up with this tube with ectoderm on the outside, which is the epidermis of your skin, lining on the inside, which is the lining of your gut, that's the endoderm, and all this stripy stuff in between, which is the mesoderm in between. And that's the basic body pattern. I have a patient who very sadly is pregnant with a baby where this hasn't completely closed. And in the area of the abdomen, it hasn't closed. And the child has got exomphalos. And the intestines are protruding from the abdomen. And when that baby's born, it's going to need major surgery to try and close the defect. But that's the lateral folding. That's how a flat embryo becomes a tube-shaped thing. And then, without going into details, if that was all that happened, you'd be shaped like the tube inside a toilet roll with a hole at one end and a hole at the other, are all lined up. But of course, we're not like that, and our mouths are on the front of our heads. And what actually happens is that the head and the bottom end of the embryo fold right over. And if you look at this picture over here, there's the flat embryo with the ectoderm on the one side and the endoderm on the other side. And over here, this heart represents where the heart is. And this little spot is that little spot on the embryo where the mouth would be. And what happens amazingly is that the brain forms in this area over here, and it pushes and pushes and pushes, and it pushes over the top, and the heart of the embryo moves round onto the front of the embryo, and then it sits in the front of the chest like that. And this bulge up at the top is full of brain. Then there's a space called the stomodeum, which will become your mouth and part of your nose. And then down below is where the heart sits. And this is what the embryo looks like during the 4th week. It's folded around, the head end is folded over, and the tail end is folded over. There's the heart sticking out there. The heart starts to beat at the 24th day, around the 24th day, which is in the middle of the 4th week of development. And that's basically what the embryo looks like about 10 days after the mom missed her period. Now, we're going very fast here. Day 28, that's the end of the 4th week. You can see the embryo here. It's curved around. This is its head. It's not very good to look at the moment. It's got an enormous heart. It's got to have a heart early, because without its heart, it can't survive. As you can see, it's maybe half a centimeter long at this stage. But there it is folding, and there's a couple of things that are interesting here. There are ridges on the neck called pharyngeal arches, which will develop into much of the face and the neck. You can see these little spots here. Those are the beginning of the ear and the eye. That's called the lens placode. That's where the lens of the eye forms. This is called the otic placode. The inner ear forms there, okay, in a very sophisticated way. And you can see the beginnings of the limbs growing out here. These are the limb buds. By day 35, now we're looking at the end of the 5th week. You can see these little bumps, which were the limbs, have now become divided. There's an elbow groove and a wrist groove, and the hand is shaped like a paddle. That's the end of the 5th week of development. Week 6, the embryo is developing, still not terribly good looking, and you can see here's a little one here. And if you look at the hand of this one, this little fellow on the right here, the fingers all stuck together. And at the end of week 6, little grooves are forming in between the fingers, and those will break through, and you will end up with separate fingers, hopefully the right number, but quite frequently people have an extra one, okay? And that indicates we're still in week 6. The toes come just a little bit later. Enormous number of things going on inside, which we won't talk about. Here we come to week 7, and you can see the fingers are now separate, okay? So the end of week 7, the 2nd period is now a week late. And here you can see these little bumps. Those are the fingers. This is the umbilical cord here, and this little black spot is a developing eye. Across the animal kingdom, wherever we have visual receptors, the equivalent of eyes, there's always pigment around them to actually absorb any stray light. And it's there, although they can't see because there's nothing to see because they're in the dark. That's the eye of a 7-week embryo. 8-week embryo, it's now grown to 3 centimeters long, 20 centimeters long, and you can see there's fingers and toes now. The external ear has formed, although it's still not as big as it will be when they're born. And the embryo is now called a fetus because the body form is complete. That is not an absolute line, that's just a matter of convenience, but it changes its name by convention from an embryo to a fetus at week 8. Now we're into the fetal period. This is a 3.5-month fetus, and you can see 3.5 months there. You can see the eyes and ears and all the rest of it, and that's what a 3.5-month fetus looks like. Here are pictures of fetuses, and they just gradually get bigger and bigger and look more and more like little children. The physiology is really quite relevant to these things. Not that a change in function necessarily means you become a human or not, but it's just interesting to know. At week 8, when the embryo became a fetus, the beginnings of movement start, and they're just slight flexing movements of the trunk. But as you can see here, and this is not a good slide, or it hasn't scanned well, but you can see this is a startle movement, general postural movements, it's hiccups and so on, and you can see when these are happening, and this is happening 9, 10, 11, 12 weeks. By 12 or 13 weeks, there's a full spectrum of movements happening, and they're moving around. The message that I want to bring is it's one seamless process. Many changes, but you can't draw any line unless you arbitrarily say the first synapse that fires means you're a human being. But how can one say that? Many changes, there is no specific event. Now, I understand why people want to draw lines. I had a girl come in to see me the other day, 12-year-old girl, 32 weeks pregnant, came in with her mom who just discovered a couple of days previously. And I thought, what on earth do you say? Now, nobody was talking about an abortion there because she's beyond the limit. But I can understand why people think, what can we do? How can we help young pregnant women with a desperately unwanted pregnancy? So I understand why people want to draw lines, and I've got much sympathy with that. But in actual fact, all the lines are actually fictional. There are no lines. It's one process. Is this a human being? That's me. That's my grandson. You can see there's a certain genetic linkage there. But is that a human being? How do we separate? But can I say, if someone is not convinced about the humanness that I'm talking about, the onus is on them, if they want to do a termination, the onus is on them to prove that what they're killing is not a human being. It's in medicine, they're trying to develop vaccines for COVID. The onus is on the developer to prove that it's safe, that it's not going to kill anybody. And what is needed here, if somebody wants to terminate the life of a fetus, the onus is on them to prove that they're not killing somebody. Right. Likewise, I want to suggest we're running out of time here, but it's entirely reasonable for a doctor who's done a course that included that to regard the fetus as a human being and act accordingly. We've got to find alternative ways of helping young women with crisis pregnancies. Just a reference from the scripture, the one who oppresses the poor shows contempt for their maker, but whoever is kind to the needy honors God. Now, being kind to the needy involves being kind to the mother, absolutely, most certainly. But part of being poor means you're defenseless. And there's none more defenseless on the planet than those that are too young to speak up for themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Warton. We really appreciate it. Unfortunately, because of our technical glitches, we won't be able to see Dr. Warton, but if anybody has any question, please feel free to make use of the question and answer function. We'll be taking a few questions. At the moment, I don't see any questions, but please feel free to post them and we'll try to spend a few minutes to answer those. Dr. Warton, some of the typical questions that, as I'm a legal practitioner, would typically be out there is to say, but the fetus can't survive on its own. I can anticipate your answer, but perhaps what would your answer be to such an argument?
Sorry, there was a blip when you were halfway through that question. Could you repeat the question?
The question sometimes is this, that the unborn baby, the fetus, is not viable. It won't survive outside of the womb. That sometimes creeps into the argument with regards to when does life begin, and in the legal context, it also creeps into the question of legal personality. But from your perspective, how would you answer that question?
Yeah, I think in terms of viability, it's, as I say, it's a convenient line that's been drawn, and often that's been the line that's been drawn about whether abortion should be done or not. But again, to my mind, it's an external fiction. The reality is that if you took a 1-month-old baby and left it in the wrong environment overnight, it would die. Okay, so I've got a grandson who's just a couple of months old. If a week after he was born, we left him in the garden overnight in winter, he would die. He's not viable. In fact, given the wrong environment, none of us is viable. I wouldn't be viable in Antarctica now. And so the issue is the humanness of the humanness of the embryo or the fetus. It's not what environment can it survive in or not. So it's a convenient line, but it's actually a line that's unrelated. Is the fetus a human being or not? That's the issue. And it doesn't become a human being at 28 weeks. You know, it doesn't become a human being at 24 weeks. The question, is it a human being or is it not a human being? And so I think as far as the legal personality, well, again, that would be a legal definition. I wouldn't be able to comment on that. But the reality is there's a continuum. We see the continuum from a newborn baby. I mean, you saw in my slideshow, there was a picture of the 4 little boys. You know, you see the continuum. And it's a continuum that continues until you get to university. Okay, it's a continuum, and we understand that. And I think there's a desire to draw lines, and I think it's a legitimate desire to draw lines. But I think they're all fictional.
Thank you, Dr. Warton. There's a question here. please can you elaborate on the doctor's perspective as you skipped over this slide?
Yeah. The slide, I don't know if I can get the slide back up again. I probably can't. Let's have a look here. The doctor's perspective. You know, there's a case that's happening at the present moment, or it's suspended, but of a doctor who actually advised a young woman who was pregnant about what her baby looked like, and it was reported, and there was unpleasantness about it. Now, the question is, if a doctor has done an embryology course like I've just given you in 20 minutes, but done a long course like that, the question, is it reasonable for such a doctor to regard a fetus as a human being? You saw the picture, that's real. Now, the question is, a normal response, my experience over the years is when people have looked at a fetus in a container, their natural response is, oh, look at the baby. Now, that may not be at week 3, but certainly by the time you're looking at 8, 10, 12 weeks, a natural human response. It's reasonable for somebody to look and say, but that's a little person. That's a human being. Look at the baby, okay? And a doctor, if it's reasonable for a doctor to think that way, and surely it is, then it can't be unreasonable for the doctor to counsel a patient and tell them what she or he believes about the fetus, right? And in fact, it's unreasonable to expect a health professional in good conscience to ignore that. My own conviction very strongly is that if we make our health professions do abortions or participate one way or another in abortions against their conscience, it's a huge step, because we're trying to breed a generation of health professionals who are quite happy to cross their conscience. And that is the most monstrous thing. Of all people, everybody should live in line with their conscience. But the thought that a doctor or a nurse can consciously cross their conscience, you know, can be forced to do that, is oppression in the extreme.
Thank you, Dr. Warton. There are some questions here relating, the person is asking and saying that in some pro-choice literature that she's been reading, the writers don't even address the question of the humaneness of the fetus. They totally focus just on women's rights. And another question, perhaps connected with that, or a point, is that abortionists refer to the unborn as a parasite. How will you put it? So perhaps there, if you can just touch on the focus on women's rights, and then also how pro-abortionists put it. Can you perhaps touch on that?
You see, the reason that I've made a big thing about the humanness of the fetus, that it's human, it's a person, and so on, is that while women's rights, you know, I'm not arguing against women's rights. I have no desire to oppress women. I think I have huge feelings since I've been working in maternity psychiatry. I've just been so impressed by the strength of character of these young women from poor backgrounds who've got sometimes terrible situations. I've had a number of patients who are pregnant as a result of rapes. And I look at the strength of character of them and their mothers, actually, as they handle the situation. I'm just hugely impressed. So obviously we're concerned about them. The real question is the organism inside, is the fetus or the baby or inside a human being? And if you say, like that parliamentarian said that I mentioned, that of course it's a human life, but I said, that is dreadful, absolutely dreadful. You know, if you're going to take that line, how can you complain about women being, about sexism, where women are treated as second-class citizens? You know, sexism doesn't normally involve killing the woman. So the central question is it a human being or not? And as I say, humanness is not a matter of degree. You don't suddenly, you don't sort of slide into being a human when you go to primary school. You know, it's you either are or you aren't. It's not a matter of degree. Yeah. Sorry, the second question that was raised, I've forgotten. Do you remember it, Martus?
The question was, or the point was made that abortionists refer to the unborn as a parasite. How would you put it?
Yeah. Well, in one sense, I've just likened the embryo to a parasite in the sense that it's one organism in another organism and getting all its nutrition and everything from the other organism. But the practicality is that if you're going to talk like that, that the person who's doing the abortions need to realize that they're a parasite also. Okay? They spent the first 9 months of their life as a parasite, if they want to take that thing. Whether they remain a parasite, we can discuss. I might mention our professor of obstetrics said when we were at medical school, they used to define abortions as anything before 28 weeks of pregnancy, and a stillbirth was after that. And then he said that they shifted the definition because babies were surviving before 28 weeks, and it would be terrible to go through life being called an abortion. Well, you know, if that's the case, if somebody wants to call a conceptus a parasite, they must maybe wear the cap themselves and call themselves parasites.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr.
At least a mature parasite.
Right. Dr. Warton, we have another question here. What are your thoughts about the morning pill taken within 72 hours? Would that be terminating a baby if implantation has not taken place?
Yeah. You know, sometimes people have said, and I have a friend who's very much a Christian, who maintained that life began at implantation. And so he said, actually, an embryo moving down a tube, you know, life begins at implantation and not at fertilization. Now, I really don't buy that. You might conceivably say that somebody's not pregnant until implantation. You might say that. I don't think it makes much difference, but you might say that. But preventing implantation, in actual fact, is terminating the life of a tiny individual. And so, as a matter of principle, I couldn't support that. I think there are, you know, the morning after pill is not the only thing that prevents implantation. And that's a separate issue that I'd rather not get involved with. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Warton. There's another question. With in vitro fertilization, there are millions of frozen embryos at the moment. Many women can't fall pregnant, and I've treated many beautiful children born IVF. Is IVF God's will, or is it against His will? I don't know if you would be able to answer that question or comment on it.
Yeah, I think my own conviction goes a couple of things. I think IVF rightly done, I don't think is a problem. I think the problem of the embryos in the deep freeze is a problem, okay? Because those embryos, you know, I mean, it can even be a legal problem in some situations. But I think the IVF, I often think when people are wanting to fall pregnant and they want to have a baby, we need to be careful before we say you mustn't use that technique or that technique or that technique. We need to be careful there because they're wanting something that's very good. They're wanting something that the Lord said is very good. And so in that sense, I think we need to have a good reason to say it's wrong. The embryos in the deep freeze are a real problem because in actual fact, they're de facto small humans. I might just say in practical terms, adopting an embryo actually, you know, for couples who want to have children and want to adopt, the thought that often doesn't cross people's minds, but I think, what about going to a fertility clinic and asking if there's somebody who will donate their embryos to you? And then you've got a much better chance of getting an embryo that more looks like you. But in actual fact, you're saving the life of an embryo. I mean, not every embryo that they attempt to implant survives, but you may well be saving the life of one or more little youngsters.
Thank you, Dr. Warton. It seems that those are all the questions that we've received thus far. I will, at this juncture, hand over to Dr. Albu van Eeden, perhaps if he has any questions or anything he would like to add, and then we can wrap it up with him.
Right.
Thank you, Martus. I trust everybody can hear me. I could not have agreed more with any person speaking on this topic than what I agreed with what Chris had been saying tonight. I gave him quite a tall order. I requested him to do a presentation that would somehow give health professionals and medical doctors, for that matter, material, and at the same time make it so that, present it so that the lay people would also get something out of it. And I think he's done an excellent job of it. And actually, I think it would be a shame to let all this information just go lost. So I don't know whether it might take some confirmation or arguments to get get Chris to make a recording, or we can send a team actually to go and record him. And I wouldn't mind if we could make a video recording of that, because some of these facts I could have given. But when I give it, I'm just an MD, just a doctor doing it. And there's always criticism and they always find loopholes. But it is an absolute gem to find an embryologist and somebody who specialized in neuroscience, which is a large part of the embryology of the human being, to speak, to tell us these principles. So I can just say, Chris, this is a phenomenal presentation, and I really appreciate it very much. And I would like to try and convince you that we get more of this, and one can even go into more detail so that you have certain sections that you can present to health professionals, health practitioners, and others, to the lay public. What he said, I can just add to what he said about a doctor and a doctor's view about the unborn child, the fetus and the embryo. You know, we as doctors, when a pregnant lady comes to us to be treated, we treat her most carefully in the first trimester, the first 3 months of pregnancy. Why do we do that if the unborn child is not also a patient that we're taking care of? Why are we so extremely careful about what antibiotic to give for a urinary tract infection? Why are we so extremely careful about what analgesic she can take? We cut out 90% of medicines in many cases just because we know we are treating 2 patients. And then to expect a medical doctor or a health professional the next moment, just like that, turn around, make a 180-degree turn, and be willing to kill that child, that unborn child. It is weird, and that's where what he said, that doctors that do that end up becoming monsters, ethical monsters. And I think South Africa and the South African government should value doctors who do their best to save the life of the unborn child, treat him as a patient, treating with the respect that any human being deserves, and also take care of the mother. And the last point I want to say is, I think his experience in psychiatry, especially in maternal psychiatry, makes his presentation even more worthwhile. And I won't be surprised if he hasn't got much more to say about that. But in saying that, I would like to wrap up and say, Chris, thank you very much, Martus, for arranging this, and we trust that you all enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Albu and Dr. Warton. Dr. Warton, any closing remarks, anything that you'd like to add finally before we end?
Yes, I'm sorry about the technological disasters. I suspect it was the poverty of our internet that was the issue. And it would be a pleasure to put together something there. There's so much more one could say. And you know, it would be a pleasure to put this together in terms of video or something. That would be a pleasure. And all the very best for the folk that are on the front line dealing with these issues, and strength as you make your decisions.
Thank you, Dr. Warton. And with that, we say goodbye. We are leaving the contact details of Doctors for Life on the screen for a few moments, and please feel free to email Doctors for Life if you need any more information on this topic, or if you have any other questions relating to this topic. Thank you for participating, and good night.
Thank you. Good night.